So, without demanding that we be granted immediate understanding to the issues that we're exploring in this investigation, let's continue to look at what is manifesting between our two mirrors, which are Dostoevsky's Chapter 7 from what is translated as devils, demons, or the possessed variously. In Russian, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's something like Bezi. Um, and Strauss's introduction to the Spinoza text. Let's use a rule of Strauss, or at least adduce it, manifest it to ourselves so we can consider it to bolster the previous four presentations on this subject. Strauss uses the rule with respect to Plato that we should be aware that Plato has written deliberately dialogues and not a treaty. He could have written a treaty, he chose to write dialogues, and that therefore we can't say straightforwardly this is Plato's teaching, or when one of the participants in the dialogue, even if it's Socrates, who appears to be the quote-unquote mouthpiece of Plato, is speaking, we can't say without further consideration that this is Plato prescribing something or this is Plato's teaching. So likewise, we have two characters, one of whom is known as a nihilist in conversation, in the discussion. One quick housekeeping, there is, I misspoke slightly in that the Peaver translation is translated as devils, and there's another translation which is notable for its literary merit for people who have a high sensitivity to the English language. It's produced by a Columbia University professor. That one is of some interest. So the first issue we should look at is the discussion concerning what I was saying. I posed the question whether Dostoevsky is considering all the various gods of the various nations, where nation means almost the same thing as what you hear continually in American politics, where you get the phrase "the people," but not quite the same, because in some way the people implies the distinction between state and society, but in another way it implies the attempt to disregard that distinction as made by Lincoln in his famous phrase about governance by, for, and of the people, therefore reuniting the nation as the people, and in some way disregarding the social contract break. So we have various peoples or various nations, remembering the old phrase, the nations and the cities, where cities means polises, Greek polises, and nations means any other group, Egyptians or Germans or Persians or whosoever it may be, which also opens up another question of what we're talking about there. We should remember in this context that in Dostoevsky's time, even though he speaks of ethnology, and there's some study of this has already begun in around 1750 amongst the Prussians, there's not, we're prior to the theory of evolution, so we don't, when we say Germans, we don't know exactly what we're talking about, especially through the lens of our own time. We're not talking about genetics exactly, although people of course know that there's families and there's larger families that can be called nations, and that has to do with offspring, and offspring having characteristics shared with the parents. But it's not exactly the same thing as with Darwin, struggle for existence and so on. And on the other hand, you have the concept stemming from the Greeks that being a Greek can primarily mean having a certain education or paideia. And the question of who breeds the breeders has to do not with the question of the skin color or other things, but with the question of what kind of education they should have. So even now in the contemporary discussion in the papal, in the encyclicals of the Pope, papal encyclicals, you have these phrases like, is the Greek reasoning universal or not? Is it merely Greek reasoning? But this doesn't get to the nub of the difficulty, because then you don't know what does it mean to be Greek? Does being Greek have to do with being civilized, have to do with some kind of improvement of the raw materials of a human being through education? Does being Greek mean this Heideggerian sense? Certainly it didn't in former times, of that the principle of differentiation of the peoples of their time, each people has an exact sui generis time which they live, which can't be repeated. What does being Greek mean there? That question is left aside in the Catholic discussion, because they assume the answer through doctrine which has been long developed for millennia. So the question we have in the Dostoevsky chapter is that we're setting the various gods of the various people, which Dostoevsky tells us the people are always striving towards this. And he tells us that the Romans have been striving towards the state, which is very interesting. So that has something to do with eventually coming to Hobbes and the social contract thinking of the analysis of the state becoming a question of analysis of government over and against society, as in the what Schmidt criticizes and so forth. Were the Romans the ones of all human beings who have produced the state and who have produced religio officii as this loyalty to the state, as the publicness as against the privateness, which is privateness is, we can point to the word idiot, where idiot means not only privateness, but it means primarily someone who does not have a professional. It means something like layman. So someone who doesn't have a training which is viewed to be good for the collective or good for the country. I know the word collective is somehow a difficulty here because of the way the popular discussion, like Jordan Peterson uses the word. But let's step over that for the moment. So you have these different gods, and these are the things that, according to not Dostoevsky, but to the characters Shatov and Stavrogin, are saying each people must have, otherwise they'll die as a people. And then the question is there one ground out of which these different gods, whether it's the state or whether it is, in the case of the Greeks, philosophy, which then this gets to the nub of our discussion with Strauss, is the question of does philosophy prescribe to human reason, which already exists, a certain character which is particular to Greek reason? So that the reason of Plato is not reason full stop, so that the reason spoken of in Deuteronomy 4:6 that Strauss attributes then to Spinoza is a different sense of reason. What's the ground of that? And then we can ask, is there a ground back behind all these gods, and which ground is it? So ultimately we could try to show, what I wanted to try to motivate this particular sortie is to show the distinction between Strauss and Heidegger on a deeper basis, whereby Strauss's sense of reason. So you know that Strauss, for instance, they point to Strauss showing that through reason we can show that if reason must be identified with science in the sense of fact-value distinction, that leads to a situation where we can't solve human problems, and then you get it makes sense to go into the so-called quote-unquote flight from reason, because that would be a dead end. So if the kind of reason that's associated with Plato eventually leads to the fact-value distinction, and the facts are about science, and you can't, if you have a problem so just to, it'll have to suffice to give a quick example here, although we could linger on it, but that could go on for hours and hours, the discussion about the modern scientific discussion, but I'll give a quick example. Say the current issue, some people raise the issue that Biden was sworn in 15 minutes or so early. And so can you then, is there a scientist that can then come in, a physicist or a biologist, and tell us whether it's a fact that Biden is actually president? He was sworn in 15 minutes early. The previous president was still there. The Constitution stipulates an exact moment when he's supposed to be sworn in. But is it a fact or not a fact that he's president? This shows ambiguity in the word fact that's not always brought out. So far as fact and values are strictly distinguished, you have to say the facts are on the side of the sciences, but then you have another issue, which is there's supposedly hard sciences and less solid sciences. So the question Strauss is raising is the criticism of Spinoza by Cohen and by Franz Rosenzweig accurate, or have they missed something? He's claiming that they missed something, and that Spinoza's understanding of reason is different from the understanding of reason that's tied to the Platonic good. So you have a question here of whether the human being, so God is the God who is I shall be as I shall be, cannot be identified with the Platonic good, which is the good which is eternal or sempiternal, and then God sort of reaches up as an element and takes it and molds things out of it. And this would also be the same God as is in the Socratic claim that all human beings seek the good. So, I mean, for example, if you're playing chess, you don't try to play a bad game of chess, you try to play a good game of chess, but nonetheless, you get some idea that you want to make a move, carry out a tactical sequence, and it's bad chess. But why are you doing that if all human beings seek the good? And they apply the same thing to your whole life. Why are human beings doing things that are bad if all human beings seek the good? And if we're primarily so-called rational agents. So if you're defining rational through this Socratic paradox, or which could also be viewed as a truism, everyone wants to do good in the sense of sound. They want to do the best that they can because it's obviously beneficial to do the best. They'll win that way. Then you get into some problems when you try to link that to biblical thinking, or to the thinking of the received understanding of the tradition. We have, there's multiple ways we can look at and determine or show what the image of reason is in these traditions. But on the face of it, it would seem that by the discussion in the 7th chapter, the philosophic good, and therefore correspondingly philosophic rationality, is different from um, this other God who, in that discussion, is being characterized as the Jewish God. And then again, it's different from the Roman God, which is being linked to the state. But is there then a ground sort of behind these three gods, and there would be other ones um, from which one can draw back into, and then everything, and see the beginning point where all these stem up? In some sense, Heidegger seems to be pointing to that when he um, says, when he tries to go back behind the beginning. So he's operating in the Greek tradition, in the Greek God, but he keeps saying we're going to have a new beginning. So it seems like he's trying to step back behind it, and he's doing this through the criticism of being as presence. So, for instance, that the good is already available to us, and it's already linked to this sense that everyone seeks the good, in contradistinction to the sense that the unknown God, the subterranean God who's only known to, let's say, the mystics, the I shall be as I shall be God, may be, in this sense, closer to what Heidegger is trying to get to. Heidegger would link that up to poetic use, and he says, for instance, Holderlin is slipped out from all metaphysics. He's the first poet to go out of metaphysics, and such comments. Okay, so let's leave it at that for now, and we're going to try to look more closely at some of the arguments going on in Strauss's analysis of Spinoza, and again to use the mirror of the Dostoevsky chapter.